Trihn Moser, and I'm the head of the English department, and it's my job today to get us started. First, I want to thank Dean Tom Peters, Anne-Marie Baker, assistant professor and librarian. This space is lovely. Thank you for allowing us to use this space. I'd like to also thank other members of the library staff who've helped today. I want to thank the English department for their support of this event, and thank you all for being here. It's awesome to be in a room with, I'm guessing, English majors, a lot of them. So our panel today is on Robert Wallace, Orbit of Meter, and Tour of the Archives. And I'm just going to speak, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, but I'm just going to introduce our speakers and a little bit about the topic. Robert Wallace was a poet and professor of English. He was born and raised in Springfield, Missouri, so he's from here. He published 6 collections of his work from 1957 until 1989. And his writing Poems is a textbook that's still used in poetry writing classes. Wallace also founded a letterpress publishing company, which he named Press. It is this endeavor that our very own small literary press, Moon City Press, is based upon. The Wallace Archive is an important one to those of us who specialize in English studies. Made up of Robert Wallace's papers, it promises to reveal important insights about the craft of poetry, the workings of a small press, and the formation of a community of poets who work to share their passion with multiple audiences. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers today. Tina Wallace, who is a kindred spirit to us because she was also an English major. We're all over the place. Tina enjoyed a career as a lawyer, working for the judicial branch of government, assisting judges, and drafting proposed decisions. She described herself to me as a technical writer, a modest description for someone who helped multiple judges of an appellate court resolve decisions. That's us, English majors, just very modest. Her commitment to the work of her late first husband and stewardship of his papers makes the publication of Orbit of Meter possible. Her support also makes possible the Wallace collection. Dr. James Baumlin, I think you know, is the editor of Orbit of Meter with Anne-Marie Baker, assistant professor of library science. He is distinguished professor of English at Missouri State University, where he teaches courses in early modern English literature, critical theories, and the history of rhetoric, having published extensively in these fields. And I'm not going to list all his publications because we can get all day. He is also widely published in rhetorical theory and composition pedagogy. His current research focuses on the history of Western ethos from antiquity to the present day. In addition, Dr. Baumlin has introduced his students to archival research, inspiring them to do original work. While time-consuming and often difficult, archival content allows scholars to delve into the past. I think it allows us to travel into the past, to transform historical research into current knowledge. And our final speaker today, actually, I guess that's the order you're going to go with, is Tracy Gieselman-France. She's an archivist for special collections and archives here at Missouri State's Meyer Library. She has been featured on the Missouri Library Association website for her work as an archivist who preserves important historical materials. Special Collections and Archives is a cluster of collections and services at the Missouri State University Libraries and just celebrated, last year, its 25th year. Tracy's work has been instrumental in its success of special collections and its continued expansion. So please join me in welcoming our 3 speakers.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the English department and the Special Collections and Archives for giving us this opportunity to introduce the faculty and students to the life work of my first husband, Bob Wallace, and the treasure trove of information that is contained within his professional records that are now housed in your library's archives. But the main event that brings us here today is the Ozarks Studies Institute's publication of Bob's final work called Free Verse in the Orbit of Meter. This is, for me, literally fulfillment of a deathbed promise that I made to Bob back in 1999. And I will tell you, it is a psychological weight off my shoulders. But the credit primarily belongs to Dr. Baumlin and Professor Ann Baker, the head of Special Collections and Archives, who pulled together a collection of Bob's writings on poetry and prosody to make this book a comprehensible whole. I cannot thank you enough. So first a word about the origin of the orbited meter. Back in the early 1990s, my husband undertook, this is Bob, undertook to demonstrate that a single system could be used to analyze all English poetry so that all poems could be discussed on the same terms. His basic thesis was that there is only one meter in English, accentual syllabic, and its basis is iambic, because English is a stress-based language, and the iamb is the most common stress pattern. I won't go into the details of his thesis because it is very technical, and I'm not a professional in this area. So, but he basically tried to clarify the language that was used, update the terminology, and remove what he saw as needless sources of confusion in how people read or analyzed poems. When Bob shared his ideas with several friends and colleagues, he got a very wide range of responses, from near complete agreement to total outrage. Miller Williams, the editor of the University of Arkansas Press, was one of the early reviewers, and he saw the possibilities for a lively debate in book form. So he and Bob conceived of the idea of a book called Meter in English, in which Bob laid out his proposed principles, and then 14 other poets and scholars responded to what he had to say, and then he replied to them in turn. David Baker of the Kenyon Review in Ohio acted as the editor and the referee, and they needed a referee. It got sometimes quite heated. At the end of it all, Bob still felt that he could improve on his thesis, so he wrote yet another series of essays to further explore his ideas. These became Free Verse in the Orbit of Meter. Unfortunately, at the same time that he was working on his essays, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He finished his revisions to his preface literally as he was dying and had me promise to see it published. So now, 24 years later, it is published. Jim and Anne-Marie then fleshed out the book further to give it some context and provide some insight into who Bob was. Bob was born and raised here in Springfield and maintained a connection to Springfield throughout his life. His mother was here, and he had aunts and cousins and some good longtime friends who lived here. And so we visited often. For Bob, Springfield was home, so we were both thrilled to be able to leave his legacy here. He was a very active poet, editor, critic, teacher, in constant correspondence with many of the most well-known authors of his day. John Updike, for example, was a classmate of his in college, and they socialized and corresponded throughout their lives with each other. Mary Oliver stayed with us for a couple of months while she was a visiting professor at Case Western Reserve, where Bob taught, and so, intimate acquaintance with Mary as well. Bob was keenly aware of the importance of keeping a record of his correspondence, leaving a trail of I like to think of it as leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for us now to his own time and place. Fortunately, the technology of his time was more rudimentary than it is now with laptops and cell phones. He had typewriters, he had carbon paper, pen and paper, so people would handwrite things, and he maintained a physical record, which is now contained in the Wallace collection just down the hall. I hope it will provide a gold mine of information for future researchers about mid to late 20th century writers. He was first and foremost a poet. He enjoyed early success with his first book published when he was only 26. 5 more new books of poems followed in the course of his life. He was also a college professor. In the 1970s, he took up printing as a hobby to begin with, and then in Bob's inimitable way, said, you know what, I can print anything I want in this press. And so, as he was fond of saying, the freedom of the press belongs to the man who owns one. And so he started first by publishing a poetry magazine that he called Bits, which was devoted to poems of 12 lines or fewer, because that was the size of his printing press. They couldn't handle any more than that, 12 lines. He later got bigger presses and branched out into small chapbooks and other projects as well, and turned it into a little cottage industry in which he even had classes in which students would help to review submissions for the magazine, edit an issue, print it, bind it, and mail it to about 800 subscribers. Later, he stopped printing the books himself and hired a professional printer for an annual of light verse and funny poems that he called Light Year. He was very devoted to the idea of bringing poetry back to the ordinary reader through humor. He thought that people were intimidated by the idea of poetry as something lofty and academic, even though actually poetry is everywhere you look. It's in music, it's in advertising, it's in children's stories, it's everywhere. If you want people to remember something, just put it in rhyme and meter. He thought that people were more relaxed about the idea of poetry. They might explore it further and keep poetry alive as a popular form of expression. He wrote many, many light verses himself and delighted in silly humor. So I'd like to close my remarks by reading one of Bob's poems, apropos to tax time, which we're all probably keenly aware of right now. This is called The Poet is Audited. The IRS takes 1/3 of what he earns, and to make certain, audits his returns. Computers punch, pale agents warily explore the tropes and figures of his Form C, profit or loss, from business or professions, sole proprietorships, and asks for sessions, critical as his reviews. See him now arrive at the tall glass and aluminum federal hive, as he must, sole proprietor of his art, to lay bare the costs of laying bare his heart. To ride up to the 20th floor and explain that to read in Boston he really took a plane, ticket, canceled check, and that he tipped a porter in Chattanooga an unreported order. To prove that the books he says he bought, ink, paper, ribbons, stamps, and as he ought, kept itemized receipts, and that he spent the sums he said he did for phoning, rent, and only used his office at home to write, never letting his dog sleep there at night. Suspiciously, they eye the meager income. His latest book, the $60 royalty he got from his latest book, the 7 for a sonnet. He doesn't say he worked a whole month on it, or hopes that it may last long after the government is pulled down rafter by rafter. No fat 10,000s in movie rights for him, no NBA's National Book Awards, nothing from Guggenheim. They're startled how year by year by year he goes about an unprofitable career, mostly showing losses, not counting hair or time or his depreciating flair. Proved truthful, purified and free, he descends still faithful to his not illegal ends, and by the public fountain in public sun goes off among the poems still unwritten.
I've given you a handout. Don't read it now. Read it when you're home, because it gives you the theses of the book that she proudly held up, and anybody who wants to buy it can have it for $20, which is it. No, not this one. Well, we have some over there. Okay. Did you know that books were made to be read, but in order to read them, you have to buy them? I'm just pointing that out. At any rate, handsome book, handsome cover. Good stuff inside. I will assume that any of you who are interested in prosody, that is in the metricality of English, can look a little bit at the various theses that I've written down. After we have talked, we can address some of these issues. So, for example, Bob, in his monograph, Free Verse and Orbit of Meter, is making a direct, I don't know if assault is the right word, but I'll say that he is essentially questioning whether there is such a thing as free verse in English, if free verse means verse that is somehow liberated from the metricality of English, in other words, by the natural pulses that for Bob would be iambic and anapestic. And I'm not going to mention to you the various feet that I learned when I was an undergraduate that were called dactyl, anapestic, trochaic. I'm not going to, you see how I did that? I always tell you what I don't do and I do. Yeah, but his theory of meter is original. And because it's original, it's controversial. And because it's controversial, there are going to be people who will agree strongly, as you said, and some who will try to figure out why they would think otherwise. Meter in English, the book that David Baker edited with the University of Arkansas Press, I believe it was published in 1993? 96, okay. How in the world do you get 12 authors each to write a response to an essay that someone has written to say, this is my theory of English, meter? As far as I know, the only successful collaboration amongst authors in the English language was the King James Bible. And somehow this one actually succeeded nearly as well too, to bring 12 different people together all to talk about the same topic. That's an important book. And this is the follow-up on it. I will leave you to explore that handout. I wanted to read a poem too. And it's on the back. It is springtime. The Cardinals are playing now, so I feel as if I have a perfect right to read on this topic. Double Play, from his 81 and 81 publication, The Common Summit. In his sea-lit distance, the pitcher, winding like a clock about to chime, comes down with the ball, hits sharply under the artificial banks of arc lights, bounds like a vanishing string over the green to the shortstop, magically scoops to his right, whirling above his invisible shadows, and the dust redirects its flight to the running poised second baseman, pirouettes, leaping above the slide to throw from midair across the color-tightened interval. To the leaning out first baseman, ends the dance, drawing it, disappearing into his long brown glove, stretches what is too swift for deception, is final, lost among the loosened figures jogging off the field. The pitcher walks, casual, in the space where the poem happened. This is classic Wallace. This is Bob Wallace. What I love about this piece, if I can just make a couple quick observations about it, is the way that it destroys English grammar. The way that it reinvents the grammar by taking what we assume were three different people, right? Shortstop, second baseman, first baseman, and by making them all work within the same subject verb, the one. It's the unity of the double play that reinvents for us what it even means to be called a first baseman, a second baseman, a third baseman. And then the way he ends it, and anybody who truly loves baseball understands that a beautiful double play is a poem. It's a poem in action. It's a poem in its grace. And I think that that Bob had the ability to take, and some of you will have heard me say this before, to take the familiar and make it seem strange, and to take the strange and make it seem familiar. And that's what I love about what he gives here. My personal feeling is that Bob is important to us because he was a teacher, because he was a poet, because he was an editor, because he was a great poet and man of letters, and because he was writing at a time when people actually had typewriters, signed letters, sent them in the mail, and you could keep them, and you could keep their signatures. And so we have a record of his work saved in the archives, which gives us a deep insight. And I'm not going to go too far into your part, which is the archive itself. But just to say that he gives us a deep insight into how one writes, how one rewrites, how one edits, how one publishes, how one works with editors, how one works with publishers, how one sells to where every aspect of book arts is reflected in that archive. And that's why Tina was absolutely right that when we in the English department were thinking of the possibility of having our own small press, we learned from Bob. We learned from his work, studied it, and we tried to do what he did. Maybe not quite as successful, but we tried. The last thing that I would say very specifically is when you go over to the archive, you will see a lot of important names, and those names will be part of a correspondence, and that correspondence demonstrates for us what Wallace truly gave to us as students of poetry. He gave us a community that would share values and would support each other. And I think the idea of fashioning poetry as a culture rather than just as an artifact is what we might want to talk about a little bit today. So I'm going to stop, give the chair to my colleague.
Well, I don't want to talk a lot about the archives. I'd rather you go down to the archives and look at them, because I think that's why archives are important. You're actually physically touching the things, which will have things on the table. We just ask you wash your hands before you touch them. But I want you to touch the actual items. I want you to see those signatures. There are copies in some of the cases, just because we wanted to have the originals on the tables. But because the reason we have this collection is a testament to the English department. This collection was actually brought in before we existed as a department. And so in 1985, 3 English professors went to the foundation and asked to purchase this collection and bring it in to complement other literature collections that we already had. So that's pretty amazing. That was, as far as I know, one of the first times we did that. And of course he was local, but he also made such an impact on poetry and had all these connections. And we were talking about community earlier, so I hope we do talk about that more. But it's just amazing that we have all of this here, and it dovetails into other collections. And so I won't speak a lot about it. I feel like you're going to see the cases and learn a little bit more about his personal life, about his poetry, the correspondence, and we'll have more questions when we get down there. I'm excited for you to see the collection.
Yeah, at this moment, I hope that you'll have some questions for us so that we can begin to create of ourselves a community, so that we can be all together. So I see your Marcus, please. By the way, Marcus, in case that if you have not yet Marcus, he is one of the poets that we have that, and we're honored to have him in our department.
I'm honored to be called a poet in this context. Could you say a little more, Jim, about the process of bringing this manuscript to publication? And I know there's probably quite a bit involved, but I'm just curious if you could talk a little more about just editing the book or...
The book itself has actually been through multiple stages of transcription, editing, interpreting, and then ultimately into formatting, checking. I mean, we spent a good year checking it, because this, I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but yeah, I'm going to try to find a decent page here. You see all those squiggles? Every one of those squiggles has to be placed over the right vowel, over the right letter, right? And so students helped. The first round actually was done by a student, Eric Knickerbocker, and Mark Smith helped. Remember Mark Smith?
I do remember.
Yeah. So that was the first stage. Yes, the first round of scholarship that I did on the Wallace collection was helped by an undergraduate student at the time. I think he went on to be a grad student. His name was Ross Payton. So we've always had the effort to make the archival scholarship that we do part of the student's experience. And that, well, Bob taught us that, right? Because Bob did the exact same thing, right? Bob used his BITS press as part of his own career in teaching. Okay, so this was a complex book. Even when we were working on it full time, there's 2 years worth of time into that, simply because of the difficulty of formatting prosody. So, I know you don't feel sorry for us, but it was work.
I appreciate your diligence.
Tell me about the concerns that Bob used to talk to you about when he was actually working on it, because I know that he must have shared with you what was a concern, a question, a triumph, you know, what was the human aspect of it?
The human aspect of it really was, I mean, he didn't have any trouble with the idea that syllabics is in the meter, that, you know, free verse is not free. You know, that wasn't really the issue. It was more, how do I explain this in a way that will make it dead clear and we can stop talking about it. You know, just talk about poems and not, you know, syllabic poems or, you know, free meter poems. You know, as if they're different entities. They're not. They're all part of the same language. So that was, he was very comfortable with that idea. Where when it was more like getting down to brass tacks of how, you know, what are the feet? You know, what are the feet that are essential to English meter? You know, and it's just real specific things, and he would just like puzzle over things and was like, this, you know, this isn't working. You know, and it was, you know, we would go over and over, and it was more helping him think it through. I mean, I'm not a poet, I'm not a prosodist, you know, so I was more a sounding board than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
in fact, when we were able to spend some time together on Sunday, we had this conversation about the quote, the question of the dactyl.
right.
Right? And I know some of you say, well, that sounds like, yeah, exactly. Oh, is that going to put us to sleep? But no, if you truly wish to feel poetry, you want to understand its vocabulary in the same way that if you want to appreciate music, you want to know its vocabulary, right? The more you understand those inherent structures, the greater your appreciation. So the conversation that we had, and this is one of the controversial aspects of Bob's book. He wanted to replace the dactyl, which belongs to Greek and Roman quantitative meter, and he wanted to replace it with the bucket. And I'm not going to explain those, you'll look it up. But we actually sat and we shared some lines together to just feel them out, you know? And so, you know, tibi sunt dotes virgo quod si de racilo. Okay, you can say that in Latin, but that's not the way you speak in English. You know what I'm saying? So, does dactyl exist? Does dactyl exist in English? I'm putting you on the spot, Marcus. Does dactyl exist in English?
I would say no.
Did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he said? I'll give you a discount on this book now.
I already have it.
Oh, he's already bought it.
Maybe I'll have
He's
to buy a
already bought
second
it.
copy.
He's already. Does anybody have any questions or comments to the audience, to this proud intelligent? Lynn Klein, Lynn Klein. You all need to know Lynn because he is one of the, no seriously, he is one of the great senior statesmen of the library. He was one of the original people to work on the book cataloging, that is the receiving of the Wallace materials, which is why it's important for him to be here, besides for the fact that he also was an English major.
So, poets write poetry, they sometimes critique, they sometimes publish. Robert Wallace did all three. And so that gets into the idea of influence, because as you point out, and as you'll see, there are a great number of luminaries with whom he was associated. Can you speak to that any?
Who his influences were
Yeah.
primarily?
Well, yeah, and did he in turn, and this may be too soon to tell, you know, because so many of them are still living somewhere, of course. You know, where was his influence?
Ah.
What influenced him?
I mean, the poets, I know early on, when he was first undertaking poetry, the thing that really interested him the most was humor. Humorous poetry was a very big thing at the time when he was growing up. And so, like Ogden Nash, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but I'm trying to remember a good Ogden Nash one.
I can't.
Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker.
Right, there you
Okay,
go.
say it
Candy is
again louder.
dandy, but liquor is
Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker.
Ogden Nash, right?
So, is he, what a wonderful bird the frog are, is that, I don't remember who
I
that
don't
is.
think I can quote that one.
Anyway, but it's I'm not sure I could either, but anyway, but he wrote humorous poetry. It was a lot of wordplay, a lot of, you know, just having fun with the language. And, you know, that's the first thing, that was the first thing that really got him going. Later, I would have said probably, you know, William Carlos Williams, I know, was a big influence on him.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
And I'm trying to think of, you know, he studied with a number of people, you know, so it's hard to know how much those influenced his writing as well. But not so much, I mean, in teaching his writing, his you know, that wasn't really taught to him. I mean, I think, you know, he learned that. They didn't have, or, you know, at least where he went to school, they didn't have like a creative writing program. He, you know, it was something he undertook himself. He got his degree in English, but it was in English. It wasn't, you know, it was, you know, literature analysis, not writing. So it was a little more self-serve, you know, back then. He did his own thing. As far as people he's had an influence on, I don't honestly know. I mean, I can think of many of his students who, you know, who obviously had a strong influence with his.
I'm going to say, in general, there's an imagist strain in what I see. But beyond that, if you were to ask me if there was a clear influence, I would have to say that I hope you don't think that this is a punt, but I'm going to say his influence is American, and just put it at that, and say that essentially what he creates for us and the people that he's working with, that they're working toward what to me I would call an American tradition of poetry that is somehow sensitive to the world that they are living in, which is somehow broadly situated in the Midwest. And I hope you don't mind me trying to localize it, but to me, there's a kind of shared voice, and I do not know how to be more precise. But may I read to you his first published poem at age 16? Okay, and it fits within the Ogden Nash, right, the Richard
Yes.
Armour tradition of humorism. Published in the Rotarian magazine, age 16. The poem reads, he set the ball upon its golf. Okay, it's a golf thing. Because when he was a child, I believe you said he was a caddy. Didn't he? I think he acted as him. He set the ball upon the tee, in manner oh so nice. He said, "This golf is pie for me," and took another slice. Maybe that was a little intellectual. At any rate, he was a humorist. But he was also interested in human situation.
Oh, very much.
So there's a sense now, maybe I'm wrong about this, but could we say that Bob was also in some ways very much influenced by the novelistic, by some of the novelistic concerns that some of his colleagues were bringing? I don't know. I'm speculating.
Somewhat, because I mean, I know like with Girlfriends and Wives, you know, is a book about all of his relationships with women through his life, where, you know, it was like he'd gotten divorced and, you know, just like, you know, where am I going wrong here? And he sat down and wrote about all of the different loves of his life from second grade until the present. Fortunately, this book was written before me, so I am not in it.
But he did write
But he
something
shared it
for
with
you.
me.
But he did write something
did.
for you, did he not?
Yes, he did. He did. He wrote 3 poems for me and printed them. You know, so I have my own book with, you know, the one copy edition. It's in the library. So.
Any questions or comments here? You know, I know we're just still being introduced to the man. When we go over and look at his material, I'm sure you'll have questions about that.
Well, I wanted to bring up the relationship with his father, because his father was a poet as well, correct?
Some, yeah.
Okay. And there's one piece, and it's actually on the table, there's a copy of the first page in the case, but he's reflecting on his father and his influence in life, and then his uncle Clarence, too,
Yes.
always encouraged him. And his father was a civil army serviceman? I don't know.
He was mostly, he ran a furniture factory.
Mhm.
That was his primary employment, but of course during the war, I know during World War II, I know he was assigned to help build Fort Leonard Wood. Actually, that was so, you know, and I assume he was using his carpentry skills, I don't know.
I read some of the letters from his father when he was away from home, and it
Yes.
just seems like there is that Americanism and, you know, everyday life.
Yeah.
that seems
I mean,
run
to
in
me,
his country.
one of the important aspects of this collection is that it genuinely belongs in a Midwest community.
Yes.
It genuinely
very-
does. It reflects on a Midwest ethos, in my opinion, which is why it is appropriate that it should be one of the archival gems
Mhm.
of special collections and archives at Missouri State University.
I'm going to add one point to that, which was John Updike, who he did go to college with, and Bob spent the early parts of his career at teaching at women's colleges on the East Coast, primarily, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania. And then he took a job in Cleveland. And John Updike wrote him a very funny little letter saying, you know, so you're going back to the Midwest, you're going to give up this, you know, this image you've made of yourself as being an Easterner, you know, being, you know, a New Yorker, being a cosmopolitan guy, you know, and you're going back to the Midwest. And yes, he did. Yes, he did. You know, that was home. That was the kind of guy he was. So.
In fact, when we go over to the archive, what we will discover is that there is a strong network that is established amongst Bob, in this case very specifically in his role as an editor, but also as a teacher, because when you have when you publish a chapbook, you would arrange for readings, and those readings would be distributed across a very consistent set of mostly Midwestern universities, where people would take turns visiting each other's departments, right? So you would actually have a group of people that were constantly mutually supporting each other in their work, both in writing and in publishing and in editing. this next question, I've told you that it's, I think last time we spoke on Sunday that I was going to say something like this, and I don't know quite how to put it.
Okay,
So you're gonna have to help me.
okay.
Was Bob aware of his importance?
I think he was. It wasn't that, he didn't think he was important as a poet. I mean, he recognized that there were other poets who were better than he as a writer. But his understanding of the process and of the difficulty of making your way as a kind of more or less regular poet, really helped him first of all, build a community of poets. He had this extensive correspondence with people, and he knew that that was important. I mean, he kept all those letters for a reason. It didn't wind up in the garbage pit. And the books, the publication again was an outcropping of that. So he felt his importance lay in how he kind of increased the volume, of poets, regular poets in a society that otherwise didn't care much about poetry at the time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. How do you create a community that is capable of supporting poets by reading, by publishing, by having that support that has to be both within a community but also reach beyond it as well. So that would have been the way I would have interpreted it, that he was important because he facilitated what, in my opinion, is the literary scene focused in the Midwest from the 1970s through the mid-1980s. As far as I'm concerned, he facilitated the things that were happening in our region at that time. You have your hand up and then go. No,
I
Marcus.
think I've already spoken, someone else was.
So stand.
I was just going to say, Stephen Dunn, the poet who was eventually a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, was one of the poets he had correspondence with, wasn't he?
Yes.
And I was going to say that even though Stephen Dunn taught in New Jersey, and I also think of someone like Billy Collins, who are known, poets who are known not only for, I think, a Midwestern voice, even though they may be located more in the East Coast, and certainly for their sense of humor. And I'm guessing age-wise that they were contemporaries of Bob's, but I wonder if his influence just in general in contemporary poetry and might also be, well, in contemporary poetry now, humor is not looked down on. It's not regarded as, it's only light verse, or, for a long time there was a lot of disparagement about how humor was used, and I don't think that's the case so much anymore. And I don't know if that's something you could speak to, or if I may be mistaken, but I wonder if maybe his connection to poets like Stephen Dunn and the example Bob gave may have had a fairly pervasive influence in some ways.
Joe Kennedy is another, and
Yes,
so
right,
it's,
F.J. Kennedy, that's
F.J.
right.
Kennedy.
That's right.
And there are several who love a good, a good little joke, a little
Yeah.
story, just something light, not, it's not meant to take the world on fire, it's just, me expressing myself about something I saw that amused me. And it's, it's nice to have, and it's nice to know that light verse is not considered, it certainly was during Bob's time, I think, that it was kind of a lesser,
Yeah.
thing.
But certainly not the way Stephen Dunn was regarded.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the distance between them is really that great.
Yeah.
Everything that I'm saying is just purely tentative and needs to be proven by further study. But to give you an example of a little unpublished couplet by Bob, I think it was titled something like "A Meeting of the Full Professors." What they're meeting over tells you what they're full of. Lynn.
That was good.
myself.
You've all, this is very interesting. I wish I were 55 years younger, and same age as some of you. And I'd run right in there. But you've put down some really good markers here already. That's a very full, rich collection in there. So with a captive audience of students here, what kinds of questions, what kinds of issues, I'm thinking, I guess, primarily you, Jim, or Dr. Moser, or Marcus, would you want your students to pursue in there? What are some opportunities, I guess I might say, kind of drum up some business here?
Can I
Please.
answer that here? I don't want to tell them. And the reason why I don't want to tell them, what I will tell them is this. Virtually everything that is in there in manuscript is unpublished. And who has ears can hear. Scholarship is based in wonder. For me, the reason that what draws me to a collection like the Wallace collection is the wonder of it. To hold in one's hand a piece of paper on Faber and Faber stationery that has a signature by T.S. Eliot on it. Or to hold a piece of stationery in my hand that has a signature by William Carlos Williams on it. To hold those things in my hand creates wonder. So what I would say is that the purpose of a collection is to inspire individuals to develop the skills that will turn them into scholars. In other words, it's not just poets, it's not just individuals who are interested in publishing. Those are two noble reasons to go to a collection like this. And there are others as well. And from my perspective, my goal, being a scholar, is to go in and see where the wonder is. So you'll notice I've punted, and the reason why I've punted is because it's up to people to find them. There's gold. If I said to you, there's gold in them Thar Hills in California, I'm not going to tell you where it is. You're going to have to go and find it yourself. So I think that if we're ready, we might just go over there and do it.
Sure.
Shall we? Let's do it. Let's go over to there.